The call came on a Tuesday. I remember it because I was eating leftover spaghetti straight out of the pot when my phone buzzed. Mrs. Henderson, the regular at the upscale cafe I worked at, needed a babysitter for her 8-year-old daughter Angie for Saturday night. Simple job, right? She even mentioned the pay, $200 for a few hours just watching TV and putting a kid to bed. I had to hide my excitement. I mean, I needed the money, and what better way to earn it than babysitting a rich kid in a mansion? A mansion. Not one of those, oh, we have a big house houses, but an actual chandelier in the living room mansion. The first thought that came to mind was how I could pretend to be chill about it. After all, I'd seen mansions on TV, but stepping into one? That would require some serious acting. I pictured myself trying not to gawk at every lavish thing, no matter how much I wanted to shout, "Is that a golden toilet?" Saturday came, and as I pulled up to the Hendersons' estate, I had to double-check I wasn't driving through some kind of theme park for royalty. The house was massive, with perfectly trimmed hedges and a fountain in the front that I swear had mermaids carved into it. I mean, who even does that? Mrs. Henderson greeted me at the door, all polished in her evening gown, looking like she was about to accept an Oscar. "Thank you so much for coming last minute," she said, her voice like the kind you hear in fancy perfume ads. "No problem," I chirped, trying to seem professional, as though I was totally used to houses with 14-foot ceilings and oil paintings on the walls. Angie, the 8-year-old, came bouncing down the staircase. Yes, staircase like the one Cinderella had. She was adorable with curly brown hair and a mischievous smile. "Hi, I'm Angie," she said, sticking her hand out like she was some mini businesswoman. I liked her instantly. Honestly, the first hour or so was a dream. Angie was polite, funny, and way too smart for her age. I'd brought a DVD of a classic Disney movie thinking it would be a big hit, but she looked at it and said, "I'm more into documentaries about space, but thanks." I had to laugh. "Right, same here totally," I said, tossing the DVD aside like it was no big deal. She showed me around the house, and it felt more like a guided tour than babysitting. I saw rooms bigger than my entire apartment and couldn't stop thinking about how ridiculous it was that a house needed that many bathrooms. "Why do you need 5 bathrooms?" I asked, mostly to myself. "Mom says they're for guests," Angie said, using air quotes and rolling her eyes. "We never have that many guests, though." By the time dinner rolled around, I was pretty comfortable. We ordered pizza, and when the delivery guy came, I had to suppress a giggle as he awkwardly glanced around the giant foyer. I imagined he was thinking the same thing I was. Are we allowed to touch the doorbell? After stuffing ourselves with pizza, Angie and I settled in for some Netflix, no documentaries about space to her dismay, and giggled our way through a few cartoons. It was the kind of babysitting gig that made me think, I could do this every weekend. Easy money, nice kid, and hey, maybe next time I'll even take a bath in one of those oversized tubs. Around 8 p.m., just as we were about to start braiding each other's hair, yes, she insisted, it happened. The phone rang. Now let me explain. This wasn't a normal phone ring. It was the kind of old-fashioned ring you hear in horror movies, where the sound echoes through a house and makes you jump even if you weren't scared before. Angie's head popped up from the pillow she was laying on and she smiled. "I'll get it." She skipped across the room to pick up the landline. Yes, landline. Who even still has those? I thought. My grandma didn't even have one anymore. Angie lifted the receiver to her ear and then frowned. "Hello? Hello?" she repeated. After a few seconds, she shrugged and hung up. "Must have been a wrong number," she said, coming back to sit beside me on the couch. I tried to laugh it off. "Yeah, maybe it was the pizza guy calling back because we forgot to tip him in gold." We both chuckled, but a little part of me felt uneasy. It wasn't just the old-fashioned phone that made me jump. It was the fact that no one was on the other end. But I wasn't about to get freaked out over one call. An hour later, just as I was starting to believe the night was going to remain smooth, the phone rang again. This time I grabbed it before Angie could. "Hello?" I asked, trying to sound calm like I wasn't imagining someone breathing heavily on the other end. But no one answered. Instead, there was just a long silence. And then, click. I hung up quickly, trying to shrug it off. Probably just a telemarketer, I said, laughing awkwardly, though my heart was racing. Telemarketers don't hang up, though, I thought, but kept that to myself. Angie gave me a look that told me she didn't believe me, but she didn't push it. You sure? Positive, I replied. Now, what do you want to do next? Braids? Board games? Ooh, or we could pretend to be detectives and solve the mystery of why rich people need chandeliers in their bathrooms. She giggled at that, and the tension in the room eased for a moment. But the ringing in my ears from the strange call still lingered. Just when I thought we'd moved past the weirdness of the phone calls, the doorbell rang. I don't know what it was, but something about the way the chime echoed through the house made my skin crawl. I was half expecting it to be a friend of the family, or maybe even Mr. and Mrs. Henderson returning early. But as I approached the door, I saw the faint outline of headlights beaming through the window. And then I saw them. Figures climbing over the gate. Not just one, but 2, 3. I stopped counting. My heart leaped into my throat. Angie, go upstairs. Now, I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. She stared at me wide-eyed before bolting for the staircase without a word. I looked back out the window. The men, there were definitely men, were climbing over the gate and walking toward the front door. I couldn't make out their faces, but they were wearing dark clothes and what looked like ski masks. They carried crowbars? For a second, my brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe they're construction workers? Really dedicated ones who work at night? Yeah, no, that's not a thing. Panic surged through me. I bolted for the door and locked it, flipping every latch and deadbolt I could find. Then I turned off the lights, trying to make the house look empty. Please, please, please let them think no one's home. I ran upstairs to find Angie, who was already in her parents' bedroom, pacing nervously. Are they gone? She asked in a small voice. No, but we're going to be okay, I said, trying to sound brave. Do you have a place we can hide? Angie nodded. We have a safe room. A safe room, of course. This house probably came with a panic button, too. She led me down the hall and opened a hidden door behind a bookshelf. Inside was a high-tech room, complete with monitors showing every security camera around the property, a stocked mini-fridge, and enough space for us to sit down comfortably. Is that a massage chair? I asked incredulously, because of course the safe room had a massage chair. Angie just shrugged as if it was no big deal. Yeah, Dad likes to be comfortable when he's panicking, she said, and I couldn't help but laugh despite the fear gnawing at my insides. We settled into the room and I locked the door behind us. The monitors showed the men outside, prowling around the house. They seemed to be searching for a way in, and my stomach twisted in knots. They weren't here to steal. They were looking for something, or someone. The safe room was quiet, eerily quiet. Angie sat in the corner, hugging her knees to her chest, her eyes glued to the monitors. The men outside were still circling the house, checking doors and windows. I kept watching, hoping they'd give up and leave, but they didn't. They seemed determined, their movements calculated, as though they knew exactly what they were looking for. Do you think they'll find us? Angie asked, her voice barely a whisper. I knelt beside her and squeezed her hand, trying to give her some kind of comfort. No, they won't. This room is safe. Your parents built it for this kind of situation. We just need to wait it out. Angie nodded, but the fear in her eyes told me she wasn't convinced. Honestly, I wasn't either. The men weren't acting like normal burglars. There was something more sinister about them. I glanced back at the monitors. One of the men had stopped at a window on the second floor, the one that led to Angie's bedroom. He stood there for a long time, staring through the glass as if he knew someone was inside. My heart pounded in my chest. How did they know? How could they possibly know? We waited in silence, the minutes ticking by painfully slow. Every now and then, Angie would ask me a question. Why are they here? Do they want to hurt us? Should we call the police? I did my best to answer, trying to keep her calm, but the truth was, I didn't know what was happening or why these men were so fixated on the house. Then the phone rang again. It was the same old-fashioned phone, the one that had been giving me the creeps all night. only this time it rang inside the safe room. Angie's eyes went wide. "Why is it ringing in here?" I didn't have an answer. My hands shook as I picked up the receiver. "Hello?" A voice crackled on the other end, low, guttural, like someone trying to mask their real voice. "You can't hide forever." I froze, my throat tightening. I wanted to hang up, but I couldn't. The voice continued, each word making my skin crawl. "I know you're in there. I'm coming for you." And then, just like that, the line went dead. I dropped the phone, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Angie was staring at me, her face pale. "What did they say?" I didn't want to tell her the truth, but I knew I couldn't lie. "They know we're in here." Panic surged through me, but I knew I couldn't let it take over. Angie was counting on me. I had to keep it together, even if my heart was pounding in my chest and my hands were trembling. "Okay, listen," I said, forcing calm into my voice. "We're safe in here. They can't get to us. But just in case, let's make a plan." Angie nodded, her eyes wide but focused. "What do we do?" I looked around the room, my mind racing. There had to be something, a way out, or at least a way to defend ourselves if they got in. I spotted a heavy flashlight on the shelf and grabbed it. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. First, we stay quiet. No matter what, we don't make a sound. And if they do get in... I hesitated, not wanting to scare her, but knowing I had to be honest. "If they get in, we run. We don't stop until we're out of the house and far away." Angie swallowed hard, but she nodded. "Okay, I'm ready." I wasn't sure if I was, but I didn't have a choice. We sat in silence for what felt like hours, watching the monitors as the men continued to search the house. They had split up, each one checking a different part of the mansion. I prayed they wouldn't find the hidden door that led to the safe room. Then suddenly one of them did. I saw him on the monitor, a tall man with broad shoulders and a black ski mask. He stopped in front of the bookshelf, tilting his head as if he sensed something was off. Slowly, he reached out and pressed his hand against the wall. My heart dropped into my stomach. He knew. "Angie," I whispered, grabbing her hand. "We need to go, now." We slipped out of the safe room as quietly as we could, but my nerves were shot. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a gunshot. My breath came in shallow gasps, and Angie kept her hand clutched tightly in mine. Suddenly, the sound of splintering wood filled the air. They had broken into the safe room. I didn't dare look back. We were running now, my heart pounding in my ears. "We need to get to the front door," I whispered urgently, pulling Angie toward the stairs. But as we rounded the corner, we saw one of the masked men blocking the exit. Panic set in. We were trapped. Angie clung to me, her small body trembling. My mind raced as I tried to think of a way out. We couldn't go back. There were men behind us, and now there was one in front of us. We had nowhere to run. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the chandelier. It was one of those massive, ornate chandeliers that hung from the ceiling like something out of a fancy hotel. And it was directly above the man blocking our path. Without thinking, I grabbed the heavy flashlight from my pocket and hurled it as hard as I could at the chain holding up the chandelier. It was a long shot, but by some miracle, the flashlight hit its mark. The chain snapped and the chandelier came crashing down, smashing into the masked man below. The noise was deafening, and for a moment I was too stunned to move. But then I realized we had a chance. "Run!" I shouted, pulling Angie toward the door. We raced down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. Behind us, I could hear the other men shouting, their footsteps thundering after us, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. We reached the front door, and I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking. Finally, the door swung open, and we burst outside into the cool night air. We ran across the lawn, not daring to look back. The men were still inside, but I knew it wouldn't be long before they realized we were gone. My legs ached and my lungs burned, but I didn't stop. Angie was keeping up surprisingly well, her little feet pounding the pavement as we ran toward the gate. "Almost there!" I gasped, my voice strained. But as we reached the gate, I realized it was locked. I hadn't even thought about it before, but of course the rich people's mansion had a locked gate. There was no way we could climb over it. It was way too high and we were exhausted. We were trapped again. Angie tugged on my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "What do we do now?" I looked around, my mind racing. There had to be another way out. But then I heard it. The sound of footsteps behind us. The men were coming. We didn't have much time. I grabbed Angie and pulled her behind a nearby bush, praying they wouldn't see us. My heart was racing and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. The men emerged from the house, their flashlights sweeping across the yard. I held my breath, trying to keep as still as possible. Angie was shaking beside me, but she stayed quiet. The men were getting closer. I could hear them talking, their voices low and menacing. "We know you're out here," one of them called, his voice sending chills down my spine. I didn't know what to do. We couldn't stay hidden forever, but there was no way we could make it past them without being seen. Then, just as I was about to give up hope, I saw something. Lights in the distance. Headlights. A car was coming up the driveway. The car's headlights cut through the darkness and the men froze, their flashlights dropping to their sides. I could see them exchange glances, clearly not expecting anyone else to show up. The car pulled up to the gate, and I recognized the sleek black vehicle. It was Mr. and Mrs. Henderson. They were home. Without thinking, I jumped up from behind the bush and waved my arms frantically. "Help! Over here!" The men scattered, realizing they were outnumbered. They ran back toward the house, disappearing into the shadows. The car screeched to a halt, and Mrs. Henderson stepped out, her eyes wide with shock. "What's going on? Are you okay?" I collapsed to the ground, my legs giving out beneath me. "We're fine," I gasped, relief washing over me. "But we need to call the police, now!" The sirens arrived soon after, blaring through the quiet night as police cars swarmed the estate. Blue and red lights flashed, reflecting off the mansion's stone walls, making the whole scene feel surreal. I sat on the front steps of the house, my head still spinning from the events of the night. Angie was beside me, wrapped in a blanket one of the officers had given her. Mrs. Henderson was pacing nervously, her phone glued to her ear, while Mr. Henderson spoke with the police, his face pale but composed. "They were professionals," he told one of the officers. "They knew what they were doing. They weren't just random burglars." I stared off into the distance, trying to make sense of it all. Who were those men? Why had they come? What did they want? My mind was swirling with questions, but no answers came. Angie leaned against me, her small body trembling despite the blanket. "Are they gone?" she whispered. I nodded, squeezing her shoulder reassuringly. "Yeah, they're gone. The police will make sure of it." But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Those men had been after something specific, something they thought was inside the house. But what? Hours passed and the police continued their investigation, combing through the house and questioning everyone. I gave my statement, recounting everything that had happened, but I still couldn't explain why those men had targeted the Hendersons' home. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale light over the lawn, one of the detectives approached me. He was tall and thin, with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Miss, I just have a few more questions," he said, pulling out a notepad. "You mentioned that one of the men said something to you over the phone. Can you repeat what he said?" I swallowed, my throat dry. He said, "You can't hide forever," and then he hung up. The detective frowned, jotting down my words. "Did he say anything else? Did he mention why they were there?" I shook my head. "No, that was it." He paused for a moment, his pen hovering over the page. "It's strange. They didn't take anything. Not even when they had the chance. It's almost like they weren't here to rob the place." A chill ran down my spine. I had been thinking the same thing, but hearing it out loud made it feel even more ominous. "What do you think they wanted?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The detective glanced over at the house, his expression unreadable. "That's what we're trying to figure out." After what felt like an eternity, the police finally left, but not before telling Mr. and Mrs. Henderson that they'd be keeping a close eye on the house. They assured us that the men wouldn't be back, but I wasn't so sure. Something told me this wasn't over. Mrs. Henderson knelt down in front of Angie, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "Sweetie, are you okay?" Angie nodded slowly, but her eyes were distant. I could tell she was still processing everything that had happened. "We're so sorry, honey," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice breaking. "We should never have left you alone." "It's not your fault," I said quickly. "You couldn't have known this would happen." Mrs. Henderson gave me a grateful smile, but there was still a shadow of guilt in her eyes. "Thank you for protecting her. I don't know what we would have done if—" She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't have to. I knew exactly what she was thinking. Later that afternoon, after things had settled down, I found myself wandering through the house. I don't know why. I guess I just needed to make sense of it all. The sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows on the floor, and for the first time, the mansion felt less like a home and more like a fortress. As I walked past the study, something caught my eye. The bookshelf, the one that had led to the safe room, was slightly ajar. Curious, I pushed it open, revealing the small hidden room behind it. I stepped inside, my heart racing as I looked around. The safe room was empty just as we had left it, but something felt off. I scanned the walls, my gaze falling on a small framed photograph on the shelf. It was a picture of Mr. Henderson, standing beside an older man I didn't recognize. They were shaking hands, smiling for the camera. I picked up the photo, studying it closely. There was something written on the back in neat cursive handwriting. "To George, my partner and friend. R." Who was R? And why did this picture seem so important? Suddenly, a realization hit me. The men hadn't been after money or valuables. They had been after something else, something connected to Mr. Henderson and this mysterious man. I couldn't shake the feeling that the photograph was a clue. It seemed too important to ignore, but I wasn't sure what it meant or how it connected to the break-in. All I knew was that I needed answers. That evening, after Angie had gone to bed and the house had quieted down, I approached Mr. Henderson. He was sitting in his office, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring out the window. "Mr. Henderson," I began, hesitating for a moment, "can I ask you something?" He looked up, his expression tired but kind. "Of course. What's on your mind?" I held up the photograph. "Who's this?" For a moment I thought he might not answer. His face darkened and he took a long sip of his drink before speaking. "That's Richard," he said finally. "My business partner. We started the company together years ago." I nodded slowly, waiting for him to continue. "He passed away about 5 years ago," Mr. Henderson said, his voice heavy with emotion. "It was sudden. Heart attack. I haven't talked about him in a long time." "I'm sorry," I said softly. "But do you think the break-in could be connected to him?" Mr. Henderson frowned, clearly surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" I hesitated, unsure if I should say what I was thinking, but I had to. "Those men, they weren't after money. They were looking for something else, and I think it might have to do with your company, or Richard." Mr. Henderson stared at me, his expression unreadable. For a long moment he didn't say anything. Then, finally, he spoke. "There's something I haven't told you," he said quietly. "Something about Richard and the company. Something that might explain why this is happening." Mr. Henderson took a deep breath as if steeling himself for what he was about to say. "Richard and I, we didn't just start a business together. We made a deal." "A deal?" I repeated, confused. He nodded, his eyes distant. "We were young, ambitious. We wanted to build something big, something that would last. But we didn't have the resources, the connections. So we made a deal with someone who did." "Who?" I asked, leaning forward in my seat. Mr. Henderson shook his head. "I can't say. All I can tell you is that it was a mistake, a terrible mistake. And now, I think it's coming back to haunt me." I stared at him, my mind racing. Could this mysterious deal have something to do with the men who broke into the house? Was this all part of some unfinished business from the past? Before I could ask any more questions, Mr. Henderson stood up, his expression grim. "I'm sorry," he said, "but there are things you don't need to know. It's safer that way, for you and for Angie." And with that, he walked out of the room, leaving me with more questions than answers. It was a regular night and I was home alone, feeling the quietness settle in as it usually did after midnight. My parents were out of town, so I had the whole house to myself. I didn't mind much. I had done this plenty of times before. Around 3 a.m., just as I was starting to fall asleep, a loud knock came from the front door. My heart skipped a beat, but I shook it off. Maybe it was just my imagination. I stayed in bed, listening carefully, hoping it wouldn't happen again. But then, it came again. This time louder. Bang, bang, bang! Who knocks on someone's door at 3 a.m.? I grabbed my phone and checked the time. Yep, exactly 3:05. I didn't want to answer the door, but curiosity got the best of me. Slowly, I climbed out of bed, creeping down the hallway as quietly as I could, so whoever it was wouldn't hear me coming. I peeked through the peephole, expecting to see someone, maybe a neighbor or even a prankster, but there was no one. The porch light flickered slightly, casting eerie shadows across the front yard, but the knock had definitely come from the door. I was sure of it. I stood there for a moment, my heart racing. Maybe it was just some kids messing around, I thought. I went back to my room, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling creeping up my spine. But as soon as I lay down, I heard the knock again. This time it was softer, almost like a tap. It was as if someone knew I was ignoring them and wanted to get my attention. I grabbed my phone again, this time ready to call the police if I needed to. I stood by the door, phone in hand, feeling the cold wood against my fingers as I debated opening it. I thought about calling my parents, but they were hours away, and I didn't want to freak them out. Another knock came, gentle but persistent. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly turned the doorknob, barely cracking the door open. The cool night air hit my face, but the porch was empty. Suddenly, from the side of the house, I heard a rustling sound. It was like someone was walking along the side yard, dragging their feet through the grass. My chest tightened. I didn't know what to do, so I shut the door, locking it tightly and bolting up the stairs to my room. I closed my door, locked it, and sat on the bed, clutching my phone, my hands trembling. I tried to calm myself down, but the noises outside didn't stop. There was scraping, almost like someone was dragging something metal along the side of the house. My room was on the second floor, and I had a small window that overlooked the backyard. I hesitated before walking over, part of me too terrified to even look, but I had to know. I pulled the curtain back just a little and peered outside. At first I didn't see anything. The backyard was still, illuminated only by the dim glow of the moon. But then, in the far corner of the yard, near the tree line, I saw something moving. A figure, tall and hunched, was standing there watching the house. I slammed the curtain shut, heart pounding in my chest. What was that thing? Was it a person? A shadow? I didn't know, but I wasn't about to wait around to find out. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my fingers shaking as I pressed the numbers. When the operator picked up, I tried to stay calm as I explained what was happening. The operator assured me that help was on the way, but those few minutes of waiting felt like hours. I kept staring at the door, expecting it to burst open at any moment. The knocking had stopped, but the dread inside me hadn't gone away. Ever since I was a kid, I had always been scared of the dark. I knew it was silly, but something about the stillness of the night always made me feel uneasy. It wasn't until I moved into my new apartment that those childhood fears started to creep back into my life in ways I never expected. The first night in the apartment was normal. I spent the evening unpacking boxes, setting up furniture, and trying to get comfortable in my new space. But as soon as I lay down to sleep, I felt it. That strange feeling like someone was watching me. I glanced around the room, half expecting to see something out of the corner of my eye, but everything seemed normal. I told myself it was just nerves from moving into a new place. But as the days went on, that feeling never went away. Every night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I would wake up, my heart racing, feeling like there was something in the room with me. I didn't see anything at first, but I could feel it. You know how sometimes you just know someone's there even when you can't see them? That's how it felt. One night as I was lying in bed, I saw it. A shadow, darker than the darkness itself, standing in the corner of my room. It didn't move, it didn't make a sound, but it was there. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but when I opened them again, the shadow was still there. I was frozen with fear. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what I was looking at. Could it be a person? No, it didn't look like any person I'd ever seen. It was too tall, too thin, and its edges seemed to blend into the darkness. I wanted to scream, but the fear had stolen my voice. All I could do was lie there, staring at this thing, hoping it would go away. After what felt like forever, I closed my eyes tightly, praying that when I opened them, the shadow would be gone. When I finally did open them, the corner was empty. The shadow was gone, but the fear remained. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that it had all been a dream. Maybe I was just overtired from the move, or maybe it was some weird trick of the light. But deep down, I knew it wasn't a dream. Something had been in my room that night, and I wasn't sure it was ever going to leave. Over the next few nights, I kept seeing it. Sometimes it would stand in the corner, other times it would be by the window, but it was always there, watching. I never told anyone about it because I knew how crazy it sounded, but every night it became harder and harder to sleep. One night the shadow moved. It didn't just stay in the corner like it usually did. This time it came closer. I watched in horror as it slid across the room, silent and slow, until it was standing right by my bed. I could barely breathe as it loomed over me, its presence so heavy I felt like I was suffocating. I wanted to run, to get out of the apartment and never come back, but my body wouldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear, trapped in my own bed as this thing stood over me. All I could do was close my eyes and hope that when I opened them, it would be gone. When I opened my eyes, the shadow had retreated back to its usual corner, but I knew this wouldn't be the last time it came so close. It was getting bolder. The fear in my chest was so overwhelming that I knew I couldn't stay in the apartment anymore, at least not without some kind of explanation. The next day, I talked to the landlord. I didn't mention the shadow directly, but I asked about the apartment's history, if anyone had ever mentioned anything strange happening there. The landlord just smiled, brushed off my questions, and told me the place had been rented out for years with no issues. I left the office feeling more uneasy than ever. I had no choice but to go back to the apartment and face the night once again. That night, I was determined to stay awake. I figured if I could catch the shadow moving again, maybe I could get some proof. I set up my phone to record, placing it on my dresser with the camera pointing toward the corner of the room where the shadow usually appeared. Then I lay down, staring into the darkness, waiting. For hours, nothing happened. My eyelids grew heavy, and just as I was about to give in to sleep, I saw it. The shadow was back, standing in the corner like it always did, but this time it wasn't alone. Another figure, even darker and more twisted, stood beside it. My heart raced as I reached for my phone to check the recording, but as soon as I moved, both shadows disappeared. The next morning I checked the footage. At first it was just me lying in bed, tossing and turning, but then at around 2 a.m. the screen went completely black. The camera had been recording, but it didn't capture anything after that moment. No shadow, no movement, nothing. It was like something had purposely blocked the camera. I didn't know what to do anymore. The shadows were getting stronger, and I was losing sleep, trapped in a never-ending cycle of fear. I couldn't escape them, no matter how hard I tried. Every night they came closer, and I knew it was only a matter of time before something terrible happened. I decided to call a friend. I hadn't told anyone about the shadows before, but I needed help. I couldn't keep facing them alone. My friend Matt didn't believe in ghosts or anything supernatural, but he agreed to come over and stay the night with me. He figured I was just stressed out and needed someone around to keep me calm. That night, we both sat in the living room, keeping the lights on. Everything seemed normal at first. We watched TV, laughed, and tried to take my mind off things. But as the night went on, I could feel the air change. It grew colder, heavier, like something was creeping in from the darkness. I didn't say anything, but I knew the shadows were there watching us. Around 3 a.m., Matt started to feel uneasy. He stood up, pacing around the room, asking if I had turned the heat off because it was freezing. I hadn't touched the thermostat. Suddenly, the lights flickered. That's when I saw it. The shadow had moved from my bedroom to the living room. It was standing behind Matt, just inches away from him. I tried to scream, to warn him, but my voice caught in my throat. Matt must have sensed something because he turned around, but by the time he did, the shadow was gone. He looked at me confused, but all I could do was point toward the spot where it had been. Matt didn't see anything, but I could tell he felt it. The fear in his eyes said it all. Growing up, I had a fear of windows at night. I always felt like someone could be standing out there watching, waiting. It wasn't until I moved into my first apartment on the ground floor that my fear became reality. It was a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where nothing ever happened. The first few weeks were peaceful. I enjoyed the solitude, living on my own for the first time. But then one night I heard something, tapping on my window. At first I thought it was the wind, maybe a branch brushing against the glass. But when I looked outside, I saw him, a man, tall and thin, standing just beyond the window, his face hidden in the shadows. He didn't move, didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. My apartment had a small backyard, but the fence was tall enough that no one should have been able to get in. I blinked, hoping the figure was just a trick of the light. But when I looked again, he was still there. I backed away from the window, trying to decide what to do. Should I call the police? Should I run? My phone was on the other side of the room, but I was too scared to move. I kept my eyes on the window, afraid that if I looked away, the man would come closer. After what felt like hours, the tapping started again. It wasn't loud, but it was insistent, like the man wanted to remind me he was still there. I didn't know what he wanted, but the fear in my gut told me it wasn't good. I finally mustered the courage to grab my phone and dial 911. The operator was calm, asking me questions as I described what was happening. I kept my eyes on the window, but by the time I looked again, the man was gone. The backyard was empty, the night eerily quiet. The police arrived quickly, but they didn't find anything. No footprints, no sign of forced entry, nothing. They told me it was probably just a homeless man passing through, but I knew it wasn't that simple. There was something about the way the man had stood there watching me that made me believe he had no intention of leaving. For the next few nights, I kept the curtains drawn, trying to convince myself that it was over. But deep down, I knew the man would be back, and I was right. A week later, the tapping started again. This time it was louder, more aggressive. I opened the curtains just a crack, and there he was, standing even closer to the window. His face was still hidden in shadow, but I could see his eyes now, glowing faintly in the darkness. I slammed the curtains shut, my hands trembling. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't call the police again. They hadn't found anything the first time. I felt trapped, like the man was always watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my living room with all the lights on, staring at the window, waiting for the man to return. Every little sound made my heart race, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, lurking just beyond the glass. At some point, exhaustion got the better of me, and I dozed off on the couch. When I woke up, the room was still dark, but something was different. The house felt too quiet, too still. I sat up, rubbing my eyes when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside the window. They were slow and deliberate, like the person walking knew exactly where they were going. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept toward the window, trying to make as little noise as possible. I peeked through the curtains just enough to see, and there he was, closer than ever, his face now partially visible. I could finally make out some of his features. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were wide and empty, like they were staring right through me. His lips were curled into a faint smile, as if he knew how terrified I was. I wanted to scream, but I was frozen in place. unable to tear my eyes away from his haunting face. He reached out slowly, his hand pressing against the glass, leaving a smudge as he traced a line across the window. The sound sent chills down my spine. I stumbled backward, desperate to get away from the window, but I tripped over the coffee table and crashed to the floor. The noise must have startled him because when I looked back at the window, he was gone. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing, and ran to lock all the doors and windows. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me a few tries to turn the deadbolt. I checked the backyard again, but there was no sign of him. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind outside made me jump. I felt like I was being hunted, and the worst part was that I had no idea why. Who was this man? Why was he watching me? The next morning, I called my best friend Sarah and told her everything. I needed someone to come over and stay with me because I didn't feel safe alone anymore. Sarah agreed, though I could hear the doubt in her voice. She didn't really believe me, how could she? I knew how crazy it sounded, but she showed up that evening with an overnight bag, determined to help calm my nerves. We spent the night watching movies and talking, but my mind was somewhere else. I kept glancing toward the window, waiting for the man to reappear. I didn't tell Sarah how terrified I really was. I didn't want her to think I was losing it. At around 2 a.m., just when I was starting to think maybe the man wouldn't come back, the tapping returned. It was soft at first, barely noticeable over the sound of the TV, but then it got louder, more insistent. I froze, my blood turning to ice as I realized he was back. Sarah noticed the change in my face. "What's wrong?" she asked, turning down the volume. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just pointed to the window and she followed my gaze. She stood up slowly, walking toward the window, as if she could confront whatever was out there. "Don't," I whispered, but it was too late. She pulled back the curtain, and we both saw him, standing right outside, his hand pressed against the glass again, that same twisted smile on his face. Sarah gasped, stumbling back from the window, her eyes wide with shock. "Oh my God, you weren't kidding," she whispered, her voice shaking. We both stood there, frozen, watching as the man leaned closer to the glass, his breath fogging up the window. He tapped again, his fingers making a slow, rhythmic pattern on the glass. I could feel the fear radiating off Sarah as she grabbed my arm. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer. I had no idea how to make this nightmare stop. Suddenly, the man's hand moved to the window latch, and I realized with horror that it wasn't locked. My heart nearly stopped as I lunged forward, slamming the latch down just as he started to pull it open. The man's expression didn't change. He didn't look frustrated or angry. Instead, he just stepped back, his eyes locked on mine as if he was trying to memorize my face. Then, without warning, he turned and disappeared into the darkness of the backyard. Sarah and I stood there, too terrified to move, our hearts pounding in unison. "We need to call the police," she said, finally breaking the silence. I nodded, but deep down I knew they wouldn't find anything. The man was too smart, too careful. We spent the rest of the night in the living room, all the lights on, waiting for morning. Every sound made us jump, and neither of us got any sleep. By the time the sun came up, we were both exhausted and jittery, but at least the man was gone. The police came later that morning, and just like before, they found no evidence of the man's presence. No footprints, no fingerprints on the window, nothing. They suggested I install security cameras, which I did immediately, but it didn't make me feel any safer. I knew the man would be back and the cameras wouldn't stop him. Over the next few days, Sarah stayed with me, but the man didn't return. It was almost worse than him showing up. Every night we waited, listening for the tapping, but it never came. I started to wonder if he was watching us from somewhere else, waiting for the right moment to strike. One night after Sarah had gone home, I was sitting on the couch trying to relax. I told myself the man was gone, that maybe he had gotten bored and moved on. But as soon as I let my guard down, I heard it again, the tapping. I froze, dread settling in my stomach like a stone. Slowly, I turned toward the window, but when I pulled back the curtain, the man wasn't there. Instead, his face was pressed against the glass of my back door, his eyes locked on mine. I screamed, scrambling backward, knocking over a lamp in my haste to get away. The man didn't move. He just stood there, watching, his breath fogging up the glass. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. The operator answered, but I could hardly speak. All I could do was stare at the man, waiting for him to break the glass and come inside. The police arrived within minutes, but by the time they got there, the man was gone again. This time, they found muddy footprints leading away from the back door, but nothing else. They searched the neighborhood, but they didn't find him. That was the last time I ever saw the man. I moved out of the apartment a week later, too terrified to stay there any longer. I never figured out who he was or why he had been watching me. But to this day, I still get nervous whenever I hear a tap on a window at night, wondering if he's found me again.